In the decades following the Civil War, the United States emerged as an industrial giant. Old industries expanded and many new ones, including petroleum refining, steel manufacturing, and electrical power, emerged. Railroads expanded significantly, bringing even remote parts of the country into a national market economy. Industrial growth transformed American society. It produced a new class of wealthy industrialists and a prosperous middle class. It also produced a vastly expanded blue-collar working class. The labor force that made industrialization possible was made up of millions of newly arrived immigrants and even larger numbers of migrants from rural areas. American society became more diverse than ever before. Many workers were typically unemployed at least part of the year, and their wages were relatively low when they did work. This situation led many workers to support and join labor unions. Meanwhile, farmers also faced hard times as technology and increasing production led to more competition and falling prices for farm products. Hard times on farms led many young people to move to the city in search of better job opportunities. Americans who were born in the 1840s and 1850s would experience enormous changes in their lifetimes. Some of these changes resulted from a sweeping technological revolution. Their major source of light, for example, would change from candles to kerosene lamps, and then to electric light bulbs. They would see their transportation evolve from walking and horsepower to steam-powered locomotives, to electric trolley cars, to gasoline-powered automobiles. Born into a society in which the vast majority of people were involved in agriculture, they experienced an industrial revolution that radically changed the ways millions of people worked and where they lived. They would experience the migration of millions of people from rural America to the nation's rapidly growing cities. The United States began as a largely rural nation, with most people living on farms or in small towns and villages. While the rural population continued to grow in the late 1800s, the urban population was growing much more rapidly. Still, a majority of Americans lived in rural areas in 1900. Many of those Americans had settled on the plains in the 1880s. Abundant rainfall in the 1880s and the promise of free land under the Homestead Act drew Easterners to the plains. When dry weather returned, the homesteaders' crops failed, sending many of them into debt, farther west, or back to the east or south. Farmers began to organize into groups called granges and farmers' alliances to address the problems faced by farmers. Some farmers tried to launch a new political party, the People's Party, or Populists, running a candidate for president in 1892. Unfortunately, their candidate did not do well, drawing only about 8% of the vote. New machines for use in farming were invented in this period, but horses, oxen, and people still provided most of the power that operated the machinery. While farmers now produced cash crops, they were still remarkably self-sufficient, often making or trading for nearly everything required by their own families. Perhaps it is that self-sufficiency that gives rural life a special place, even today, in the minds of Americans. The late 19th century United States is probably best known for the vast expansion of its industrial plant and output. At the heart of these huge increases was the mass production of goods by machines. This process was first introduced and perfected by British textile manufacturers. In the century since such mechanization had begun, machines had replaced highly skilled craftspeople in one industry after another. By the 1870s, machines were knitting stockings and stitching shirts and dresses, cutting and stitching leather for shoes, and producing nails by the millions. By reducing labor costs, such machines not only reduced manufacturing costs, but lowered prices manufacturers charged consumers. In short, machine production created a growing abundance of products at cheaper prices. Mechanization also had less desirable effects. For one, machines changed the way people worked. Skilled craftspeople of earlier days had the satisfaction of seeing a product through from beginning to end. When they saw a knife or barrel or shirt or dress, they had a sense of accomplishment. Machines, on the other hand, tended to subdivide production down into many small repetitive tasks, with workers often doing only a single task. The pace of work usually became faster and faster. Work was often performed in factories built to house the machines. Finally, factory managers began to enforce an industrial discipline, forcing workers to work set hours which were often very long. One result of mechanization in factory production was the growing attractiveness of labor organization. To be sure, craft guilds had been around a long time. Now, however, there were increasing reasons for workers to join labor unions. Such labor unions were not notably successful in organizing large numbers of workers in the late 19th century. Still, unions were able to organize a variety of strikes and other work stoppages that served to publicize their grievances about working conditions and wages. Even so, labor unions did not gain even close to equal footing with businesses and industries until the economic chaos of the 1930s. The influence of national features in dress had been declining since about 1675, and by 1800 had become negligible. From then on, fashionable dress design was international. The character of the feminine wardrobe stemmed from Paris, the masculine from London. The English gentleman was established as the best dressed, best mannered in Europe. It was during this period, c. 1811 to 20, that English modes for men became everywhere accepted as correct. French dominance of what was chic for women was absolute during the 19th century. Parisian designs of garments and accessories were publicized throughout Europe and America by fashion plates and journals. At first originating from England and France, after 1850 they came from all European countries. From the 1840s, men's dress began to be more casual, but lost most of its color. Black, shades of gray and white were the norm. The formal black tailcoat was now reserved for evening attire. For day wear, tailcoats of various types were worn with a waistcoat and the new looser style of trousers over boots. Neckwear was plainer, consisting of a collar with neck scarf. The three-piece lounge suit, with a jacket instead of a tailcoat, was introduced in the 1850s for informal occasions. The average American was susceptible to many infectious diseases during the 1800s. Because the spread of disease and pathology itself were not adequately understood until the late 1800s, major epidemics continued to occur into the 1900s, however, and the practice of medicine was relatively primitive. The average life expectancy was very low. Many epidemics occurred in the new and thriving industrial centers of America, where rapid urbanization had not provided for adequate sanitation or living conditions for the burgeoning middle class. Major epidemics were causes as yellow fever, cholera, tuberculosis, TB, influenza, measles, scarlet fever, malaria, and diphtheria. The average American city during the 19th century was a breeding ground for the frequent epidemics that occurred, killing thousands. Port cities were particularly susceptible to epidemics of infectious disease. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were places where ships carrying foreign goods and disease were unloaded. They were also where potentially infected immigrants disembarked. Toward the end of the 19th century, as people searched for a way to control infectious diseases, the germ theory of disease was introduced. It became clear that impure water, crowding, poor housing, spoiled food, and other environmental conditions were contributing to high rates of disease in cities. In New York City, 1 out of every 36 people died in 1863, as compared to 1 out of 44 in Boston and Philadelphia. 190 infants out of every 1,000 didn't live to their first birthday, while nearly 1/4 of those reaching the age of 20 would not live to see 30 from 1840 to 1870. Which diseases affected 19th century populations the most? Cholera, yellow fever, and influenza, malaria, TB, and smallpox had the most major epidemics in the United States during the 1800s. Influenza, a common respiratory ailment transferred by aerosol droplets,